Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry. That was a wonderful talk, an inspiring talk. And I'm going to start just by offering a couple of other thank yous to people who worked very hard to make this possible. First of all, I want to thank the members of the board of the New Economics Institute, some of whom are here, right in the front row, so thank you. One board member in the second row. I want to thank very much the staff of the New Economics Institute who worked extremely hard measuring this room, figuring where all the outlets were, making sure, communicating with you. So many thanks to all of you from Boston and the Berkshires. We are going to experience a little of the difference between old tech and new tech. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to follow in the tradition, 32-year tradition of delivering a speech. It is a compressed version of what we will put in a booklet later. My question is similar to the one that Larry addressed. In what ways can the internet advance a just and sustainable economy? And I'm going to summarize my argument for you, so hopefully you can pick it up as I go back through it. It's straightforward. First, the barriers keeping us from building a just and sustainable economy are legacy structures created to establish and maintain privilege. We are surrounded by political, economic, geographical, and psychological fences designed to enhance the power and profit of gatekeepers who extract fees from our movements, our needs, and our aspirations. Second, we are in the first historic phase of exploring the internet's power to help us bypass these forces of convention and control. Now, I'm going to talk in a moment about the difference between the internet's functional power, the way that it expands our existing abilities, and its structural power, the way it actually changes how we think. Third, in my judgment, the internet is laying the groundwork for us not just to jump over barriers, the title of my talk is Jumping Fences, but to remove them permanently and to build human communities rooted in justice and sustainability, which I define as horizontal fairness across space and temporal fairness across time. And finally, to accomplish these goals, we must not fall victim to the new distractions, new obstructions, and new fences that people acting through the internet are working to create, to corral us back in. To sum it up, will we choose the goals for this technology, or will we allow that technology to choose our goals for us? Now, the person we honor through these lectures, the superbly creative economic philosopher E.F. Schumacher, would have been fascinated by the potential of the internet. He was always trying to consider the relationship between technology and scale, and one of the things that the internet does is turn those questions upside down, as we'll talk about in a minute. Schumacher rejected the instinct to reflect on the world in narrow ways. As his daughter once said, he tried to look at everything as a whole. And his form of thinking is needed today more than ever. So how does the internet enable us to jump fences? Let's start with a story from more than a decade ago. My wife, Ann, who's here tonight, and I were in northern Maine. We were staying in a small bed and breakfast near the Talese River, and over breakfast, holding cups of hot herbal tea, we came to know the proprietors. We learned that the husband made extra money building humidors, beautifully crafted hardwood boxes for the storage of cigars. And he explained that he had recently obtained dial-up internet in his house, and he had been surfing around looking for things to make until he came upon a website in Spain. Though he did not speak any Spanish, he studied the photographs and decided that he could make humidors. Not only could he make the ones that he saw, but he could improve on their design. He eventually found a cigar store in Manhattan who bought them for $1,200. and then the cigar stores sold them to Wall Street tycoons for $2,500. So here is an early example of a man who used the internet to overcome a set of geographic barriers to create new forms of value for himself and his customers. Now think about this. This craftsman was culling design ideas from Spain, using materials unique to the northern woods of Maine, marketing them to a high-end clientele in New York. And this early innovation pointed to new directions in manufacturing, globalization, and the economic sustainability of rural life. Through the hisses and scratches of this early dialogue, he had jumped the fence of his remote setting and freed himself to live as he wanted and where he wanted. Now, to understand the role of the internet in jumping fences, we need to understand two of the dimensions I mentioned before. The first is what I would call its functional power. Human beings have always created functional tools so they could do things faster, stronger, and more cheaply than if we relied on our own bodies. So we moved from rocks to hammers to pile drivers by increasing the force of what we could do. But some inventions not only increase our functionality, they also change our structural relationships within society. We may have adopted writing in order to extend the human capacity for memory, but literacy and literature and poetry and history and mathematics then changed how we behaved and what society could become. Similarly, the internet has both functional power, which we are learning to command, and structural power, which I would argue we are just beginning to comprehend. Now, advances in functional power tend to be seen as ethically neutral because the internet is often presented as a technology like any other, silent about its ends. You may know that technology comes from the Greek word for techne, means, the means of doing something. An alternative argument is that the internet, in creating fundamentally new capacity, is not neutral because it is changing our individual and collective relationships as human beings. In some ways, it is equivalent to a massive biological mutation in the human species because we are now able, many of us, to communicate with virtually anyone on the planet for free. We can gain access to virtually every recorded fact in history. Now, the line between the two, between functional and structural, is a continuum. And as with literacy, we often start by doing something for functional reasons, and we learn later that it's led to a structural change. Now, look at Facebook. It started off as a way for us to be in touch with our friends and for Facebook to gather millions of personal data points to sell. But it quickly expanded so that the very definition of friend began to morph into something new. Even more strikingly, it has changed the way some of us see ourselves in the world. It used to be that we were limited, we were fenced in by time, and so we could only interact with a certain number of people. But now many of us know, and we are known by hundreds, if not thousands, of others. And this has led to a shift in values. The New York Times recently did a study that showed that instead of beauty, money, and a good job among a certain population of young, middle-aged, middle-class women that they studied, fame was now the most important virtue. Now, these changes have a potential cost. One might wonder whether a functional increase in capacity has been matched by a structural decrease in the quality of human interactions. In our exuberant embrace of greater freedom, we tend to forget that there are some insurmountable barriers, such as the amount of time available within a day, a week, or a lifetime. Now, I bring this data up all the time, and my wife rolls her eyes, but you're a new crowd, so I can mention this. If you live well into your 80s, the sum total of waking hours available to you from your birth to your death is less than 500,000. That makes every hour and every human interaction precious. As Martin Buber wrote, all real living is meeting. And in allowing us to jump the fence of our physical engagements, we may be unwittingly pulling away from real social engagements. That's why the Atlantic magazine recently asked, is Facebook making us lonely? Now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about justice and sustainability. How does the ability to jump or dismantle offense affect justice and sustainability? In my judgment, justice and sustainability are relatively simple ideas. They both derive from the most elemental moral intuition that we have as human beings, which is fairness. And justice is fairness, the public face of fairness across space, right now, horizontally, throughout the world today. And sustainability is about fairness over time, from generation to generation, and beyond our species to others. When we talk about a just world, we are talking about a world in which people live under economic, political, and environmental conditions that are fair relative to all the other people who are also alive, not just relative to their neighbors, but to everyone, including those who live in faraway gated communities or countries surrounded by borders with armed guards. As Paul Farmer has said, the idea that some lives matter less than others is the root of all that's wrong with the world. So a just society is a simple concept. Everyone should have access to things that make it possible to live a decent and secure life. And that means that as a matter of collective moral and political principle, human existence should be bounded with everyone in the world set squarely at or above a basic measure of quality of life. Now, a certain amount of disparity is always going to exist between material conditions because of age, ability, energy, geography, inheritance, and luck. But at some point, those disparities move from small distortions to outright theft. Now, can the internet be a tool to tear down the fences of injustice? The answer from a functional standpoint is mixed. A great deal of wealth, as I mentioned, has been generated because human beings have been forced to go through specialized gatekeepers who restrict the flow of labor, goods, and ideas. And many times those gatekeepers had the physical control of passage enforced by the threat of violence. Sometimes the gatekeepers were specialized market makers who were the only ones who could match buyers and sellers. Whatever the origin of their power, this ability to exact payment at key economic checkpoints and choke points allowed them to prosper through the perpetuation of technological, informational, and physical bottlenecks. The closing of the digital gap and the expansion of networked access has enabled hundreds of millions of people to bypass such checkpoints. Some fences that have separated people and place are coming down. Small farmers are able to discover the right places and times to sell their crops. Students of all ages in virtually every country are increasingly gaining access to education for free through distance learning. Medical information and assistance can be transferred at rates hundreds, if not thousands of times what was available only a few years ago. Consumers are able to affect the corporate control of marketing and distribution through instantaneous comparisons of products, creating something closer to the free market than we've ever had in history. Right now, there's an interesting example over at the Cambridge Innovation Center where we are. There's a man named Noah Gordon, a sole entrepreneur, who is working to bring a device to market that you will plug into your car in the little electronic jack that people use at repair shops, and it will diagnose for you what's wrong with your car before a mechanic ever sees it. And that puts power in your hand even before you get to the mechanic. Networks allow people to seek multiple pathways to the same destination, thus reducing the ability of any one checkpoint to control the flow. And therefore, more pathways in general creates greater justice. But what about sustainability? Sustainability is also about fairness to humanity and the planet over time. Our currently unsustainable consumption of goods and services, particularly in the developed world, flows from a mindset that extraction, production, and consumption have no limits. This mindset is completely out of alignment with the laws of physics and the cycles of nature. This mindset has been enhanced by one of the most intractable ethical problems in modern life, the inability to extend our sense of responsibility beyond certain fences, certain limits. It is completely normal for humans to care about the future of our children. It is reasonably common for people to care about the future of their communities. But it is rare for people to extend that level of concern to an entire planet. We know in our hearts that we should not steal from our descendants simply because we were here first. But in powerful communities, we must recognize that in this case, we have fenced ourselves in with false expectations about the infinite capacity of the planet. So here's the irony. Because of our views, we have become the checkpoints and choke points through which the future must pass. Can the internet solve this problem? If we only concentrate on the functional power of the internet, then the answer is dubious. We may like to remove fences that confine us, but we don't like to remove fences that protect us from disturbing ideas and from the claims of others. The question is whether the glimpses, the information that we receive from the rest of the world through the internet, from the real lives of other people, too long invisible, and from the relentless, pointless, suicidal devastation of our planet, can remove us from our own mental gated communities in order to embrace new forms of prosperity for everyone. The internet could allow us structurally to create new human forms of participation, understanding, and exchange, and thus move us into a completely new and creative approach to global community building. Now I'm going to move to talking briefly about the role of the internet in political power and in the economy itself. Internet technology is steadily undermining the fact that political power derives from hierarchy. We have seen some attempts to take back control through the functional application of internet power during elections. I'm going to compress this a bit because Larry spoke about these things eloquently in his talk. But we have seen a lot of change through the kind of small funding that he was referring to. I remember in April 2003, when an upstart candidate for president, Howard Dean of Vermont, it was announced that somehow, through some miraculous method, he had managed to break all previous fundraising records, and he had pulled in the amazing sum of $500,000 in the first quarter of the year through the internet. Now, traditional fundraisers who had made a business, who were lesters, like Larry talked about, were shocked by this, but they thought it would pass. The next quarter, Dean raised $6 million, and we're now off and running through the internet funding that we're now aware of, which creates its own challenges, which we can talk about. But in the years since then, we have seen hundreds of organizations, from Move On, as Larry mentioned, to Change.org, to Avaz, develop new tools of online campaigning, this form of exopolitics, combined with social media to advance or reverse particular steps. Now, most of these uses, again, have been functional. They take things that we already know how to do, organize, lobby, fundraise, and just move them to a bigger scale. And they can be effective. When the Susan B. Komen Foundation for the Cure decided to stop funding breast cancer screening and education through Planned Parenthood, the online reaction was so swift and so intense that they reversed the decision in 3 days. When a 22-year-old woman protested against Bank of America's decision to impose a $5 debit card, 300,000 people signed her electronic petition, and the bank also immediately reversed itself. But these functional efforts can also create new structural opportunities. And I just want to refer briefly to something that I was involved in. In 1997, I was the lead organizer of a global effort to establish sustainability disclosure standards for the world's largest corporations. Now, we were laughed at by conservative, powerful industry groups because they thought it was impossible for a small network of accountants, business executives, environmentalists, human rights leaders, and other experts to make progress with such tiny resources and without hierarchical government backing. But we made aggressive functional use of the internet, particularly email, which is only then becoming available globally, and then of Google, which arrived in 1998. As a result, we were able to develop the Global Reporting Initiative guidelines for corporate sustainability long before the skeptics could mobilize to oppose us. Now, what's interesting is that we were instinctively moving away from the idea that major changes in global behavior could be secured through the pre-internet structures of hierarchy and government action. We adopted, only partly consciously, a methodology in which progress was made when people participated collectively and creatively to adopt mutually agreed upon standards. They cooperated in a network. We started off with a set of functional objectives that the internet would help us talk, and we ended up adopting a structurally new model. The communication created agreement. The agreement created alignment, and the alignment created power, and then power created change. And that was a discovery that we had not planned on. So we are continuing to see promising signs of such large-scale forms of engagement. Again, Larry mentioned a number of these. The Occupy movement, the skillful adoption of internet technology by 350.org, and many others had led to the creation of thousands of new events and new forms of participation, breaking down national loyalties in order to focus on a set of shared global concerns. Even more impressive has been the use of cell phone and internet technology to organize resistance to oppressive regimes, as we've seen in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and other countries in the Arab Spring. Again, these actions started off as a functional tactic on the internet, get a lot of people in touch with each other. But they then bore structural fruit in how large groups of previously unaffiliated people became self-aware and mobilized and democratized their voices and actions in new ways. Now, the world of hierarchy, of gatekeeping, of control, knows that this is a threat. The unruly freedom and dangerous unpredictability on the internet has led those who benefit from checkpoints and fences to try and reinsert political control. You all know that authoritarian and repressive regimes such as Russia and China are deliberately and systematically attempting to monitor and suppress communication and internet technology. And you also know that in the United States, under the Bush administration, under the so-called Total Information Awareness Program that was proposed in the United States, and that has continued in various forms in our huge and secretive security forces. Now, let's talk about how the internet affects exchange and social contract. The key functional components of the internet, speed, costlessness, and scale, have, as you know, radically altered the economics of many business and exchange relationships. In the past, much of the economy focused not only on the manufacture of goods, but as I said earlier, on determining how they would be distributed through markets and communities. And again, most money was made by people who stood at critical checkpoints through which information or products had to flow from producer to consumer. That's why ancient leaders flourished when they put soldiers to control trade routes. Retail trade has developed in marketplaces from China to the souks of the Middle East, the American Midwest, because shopkeepers had physical control of the inventory that people wanted and needed. In the early 19th century, roads and canals between physical places were often built and maintained by companies who functioned then as monopolistic brokers of access. If you wanted to carry a heavy load from Albany to Buffalo, you had to use the Erie Canal. And these interlocking forms of restriction created the architecture of production and exchange. Now, interestingly, the same was true for information. Many businesses, from realtors to stockbrokers, travel agents, and even universities, thrived on the inaccessibility of knowledge and information. Indeed, one of the themes that united all the different professions, and this came up in one of the questions, particularly doctors and lawyers, was that doctors and lawyers and other professionals had vastly more knowledge than the people who came to them. And this information asymmetry became the basis for the discussion of the need to have professional standards. The internet has disrupted many of these models, tearing down fences and allowing citizens to get their hands on previously controlled resources. We have watched as data and information that had normally been held behind various kinds of toll booths have been released for free into the world. And few people know more about this than Larry Lessig here tonight, who's written about this extensively. The music and communications industry have watched with alarm as their control over everything, from copyright to distribution, has been upended. And doctors and lawyers are now accustomed to being countermanded by patients and clients who've done their own research. The ability of the internet to explode what had been a tightly controlled pathway of information also applies to market exchange in a way that is equally important to the creation of a just and sustainable economy. And in thinking about this, I'm grateful to my colleague and fellow NEI board member, Eric Harris Brown, who's right here tonight. Raise your hand, Eric. Great guy to talk to, who has given considerable thought to the transformation of wealth made possible by the internet, a point Larry touched on in his last question. We already know about the enormous increase in the capacity for exchange created by organizations like eBay, Craigslist, and Amazon that did not exist 15 years ago. In a sense, as brilliant and profitable as they may seem, these were functional changes. The inventors seized the low-hanging fruit, a flea market, a local want-ad, and a big store, and took them to scale. And in using these tools, we were pursuing familiar actions, but at tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of times their original capacity. But today, we are witnessing the emergence of even more daring forms of structural change, which are liberating and connecting people who had stood at the periphery of our main economy. The invention of Etsy has allowed hundreds of thousands of local craft artists, many of them working in remote facilities like the humidor maker, to list their products to a national audience. And this has had the significant effect of bringing income to otherwise isolated people, enabling them to support rural or distant livelihoods without relying on the physical concentration of the city to provide them with adequate income. The rapid proliferation of these kinds of models, where production, information, and exchange can be freed to take place in healthier ways, in more disparate communities, and even with new currencies, is one of the key interests of the hundreds of groups that make up the New Economy movement. The New Economics Institute, building on the work of E.F. Schumacher and other economists, has been concentrated for some time on the ways in which local and regional economies can become more resilient and more self-sustaining while residing within a system of globalized demand and production. The New Economy movement is working to understand the relationship between its objectives, which have tended to develop and mature within particular geographic boundaries, and the internet's functional power to invent new structural understandings of economics and relationships. To put it another way, the internet tends to propel us outwards towards greater globalization, anonymity, and scale. How can that be made consistent with the objectives of affirming the values of human connection and place? Can we create systems of exchange and forms of communication that, instead of depersonalizing our social experience, actually intensify the best of human community and social reciprocity? And can we do so not just in the physical places we live, but in a manner that circumvents the political and corporate gatekeepers and establishes communities of affinity that can self-organize more democratically? One way to think about it, as Harris Brown notes, is that the internet has introduced an entirely new factor of production into the traditional triumvirate of land, labor, and financial capital. During the Industrial Revolution, we leapt forward because of the introduction of new production technologies combined with new communication technologies. These caused a surge in productivity and realignments of class and regional development. Now we have new production technology in the computer and new communication technology in the internet. And these Harris Brown refers to as process. We also know that the internet has hastened our ability to create more complex and distant forms of bilateral exchange so that people can trade money one-to-one for items and services at greater distances. And we also are in the early stages of multilateral exchange, where people can place something of value into a diffuse exchange community that earns them the right later to withdraw something similar from another person. Time banks that allow people to contribute their particular time and skills into a pool and then draw out from others are an example of this. But what is really interesting is when we start to move beyond the medium of exchange built around a single medium like money, and we start to allow for the reestablishment of new forms of social contract, ways of interacting that allow us to offer highly diverse resources into mutual use without limiting it to a particular transaction or to monetization. Now, I'm particularly delighted also tonight that we're joined by Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar and Buzzcar, who gave a wonderful speech at MIT yesterday, incredibly inspiring entrepreneur and leader. And Robin has identified a key shift towards a more just and sustainable economy. Robin, forgive me, I'm going to talk now about your example for a moment, but it's a delight to have you here as I do so. In one presentation, she points out that the biological human need for sleep created a vast social structure that made sure that there were adequate beds for people, particularly when they traveled. Now, this used to be built into the social contract. There was, in the Bible, a Judaic understanding of social contract which admonished that any visitor who arrived unannounced should be offered hospitality for free. And that's why the story of Joseph and Mary is kind of interesting. They show up in Bethlehem, and the innkeeper can't put them into the inn, but does offer the hospitality of the stable. As mobility increased, the demand for beds along roads led to the creation of the tavern and eventually the hotel. And as Robin noted yesterday, the largest hotel chain in the world, the Hilton chain, now has more than 600,000 beds available for people worldwide. And their business success has been based on complex managerial decisions about where demand was likely to be greatest, what people would trust, and how much they would be willing to pay. In turn for a promise of reliability and safety, people conceded that Hilton had a right to control the supply of available beds. But Chase contrasts this with the phenomenon of couch surfing, in which people employ a much greater inventory of unused beds in people's homes, tapping the huge excess capacity available around the world. And one of the key things about couch surfing is that people are willing to participate if offered certain reputational guarantees, and they are willing to share or to stay in places that they are unfamiliar with. She notes that in just a few years, couchsurfing has put 1.2 million beds, twice the Hilton supply, into circulation, which, again, she points out, is the result of linking excess capacity through a platform that can operate to connect people at a global scale. And so going back to what Eric says, this is a fascinating way in which money is not the key thing. It is an enhancement of the social contract. The internet can record and communicate behavioral patterns, thus establishing a reputational system that offers both visitors and hosts the confidence to overcome our natural reticence to expose our vulnerability in a sleeping state to strangers. All of this increases a factor of productivity in a far more sustainable way by putting new resources into the economy without requiring any new construction or investment, thus increasing both justice and sustainability. So are the linkages between the structural shifts caused by the internet causing changes in human motivation and behavior? Can we build a new social contract, a new grammar of mutual yet decentralized participation that is not blocked by gatekeepers, controlled by corporations, or mediated by the unidimensional medium of money? So in my last section, I want to look at the way in which the internet is changing us as human beings. The internet clearly expands our capacity for communication, engagement, information seeking, and awareness by orders of magnitude. The question is whether those increased powers also enhance human virtues in a manner that offers new possibilities for personal and economic relationships. We know the internet is changing us functionally. Is it also changing us structurally? Is it creating new pathways in our emotions, moral commitments, and cognitive abilities? Now, I've learned this is a subject of intense research, which we don't really have time to review, But I'm sure many of you are aware of a major debate about whether we are shifting from a kind of linear thinking associated with writing and reading to a more networked associative form of thought, a more visual form of thought, in which people form opinions from synchronous streams of information. But no matter where you come down on this, the internet is changing not only what we can do, but who we are. And perhaps most important, who we can choose to become. Who we can choose to become. The modern narrative of humanity is beginning to look like the traditional comic book story about a normal person who is suddenly bestowed with superhuman powers. Will he or she choose in this cartoon choice to become a superhero or a global mastermind of crime? For us, the question is whether our increase in personal power and forms of social engagement is making us more attentive, more empathic, more trustworthy, and more wise, all preconditions to a creative and systemic goal of justice and sustainability. The internet gives us functional omniscience. We can discover the answer to almost any factual question in the world within seconds. Yet we also know that the continuous tsunami of detail can produce contradictory outcomes. A near addictive desire to stay constantly in touch with everyone and everything, combined with a sense of information overload that prevents us, in many cases, from taking in anything more than the most superficial details. When we combine this with the previously mentioned limits on our time and the relentless attempts to grab our attention through advertising, we see that the commanding power of the internet can raise or lower our capacity for careful reflection. Now, I'm sure you all enjoy, as I do, when Google puts some kind of interactive experience on its homepage. It's interesting that these sometimes have strange adverse effects. In a study done of the economy and activity in Great Britain, when they put up the interactive doodle for Pac-Man, so many people played it that they estimated it caused a $120 million loss in national productivity to the British economy. And when they put up the playable guitar strings in honor of Les Paul, the tally was $268 million lost to the national economy. The continuously wired teenager walking through the streets while flitting among multiple conversations, news feeds, and videos without being aware of his or her surroundings has become a cultural trope. The internet can thus allow us to zero in on topics of interest with great precision and depth. But we are also at risk that the immensity of information that pours through our screens will perversely create a fence around our own awareness. And we have seen, and I was just reading about this yesterday, that it is the active strategy of some technological and information companies to create those fences. The happy phrase that Amazon and Google and Apple have come up with for their desire for us to enter into their technological world of apps and hardware and stay there forever is the walled garden. Isn't that great? They want us to enter the walled garden and never leave. And we are attracted into the walled garden, and we don't really notice the gate snapping shut behind us. Today, we must admit that the rapidly dropping barriers to entry, the lower cost of communication, the increased availability of knowledge, the explosion of social media, the expansion of communities based on unlimited varieties of affinity, the reduction of information in asymmetry, and the closing of the global digital divide are all coming together to alter how we think and act. The old fences are starting to come down. The gatekeepers and toll booth operators, the owners of checkpoints and choke points, are nervously eyeing the flood of all of us around the world rushing past them. But they are also working overtime to throw up new fences of all kinds: psychological, political, economic, cultural, technical, and intellectual barriers in which they can reassert control. Through our preference for efficiency and simplicity, our perverse copyright laws and patent laws, our limited attention spans, we sometimes actually encourage the swift monopolization of technology and software. And many of us have happily, as I just mentioned, enlisted in the vast compliant armies of MacBook and Microsoft users. They do the job, and resistance is futile. In return for a positive user experience, we too often allow ourselves to be herded into applications and devices that give the originating companies vast control over what we can do and who we are, thus creating new fences for a new age. To prevent all the new political, economic, and technological fences from being built, we must pull our noses above our immediate tasks and define the broad goals we seek, not only for ourselves, but for the world. Our destiny lies in deliberate and purposive action. We are the ones who will choose whether the internet ultimately becomes the new opiate of the masses or the precision tool of large-scale social change. The ancient Greeks believed not only in the importance of techne, as we noted before, but also of telos, which is direction. As one's power expands, the importance of vision and purpose increases exponentially. As we move forward through the blizzard of information and opportunity, we must also cultivate traditional individual strengths of moderation, balance, and wisdom. Those were part of the things that E.F. Schumacher valued. As the internet dazzles us with distraction, we must respond with a culture and mental architecture of focus and discipline. The political and commercial forces that are seeking to perpetuate our reactive patterns need to be bypassed by our own creative drive to create communities of affinity and power. And above all, we need to safeguard the value of those 500,000 hours, which are rigid allotment in life. So the answer to the question, can the internet be an instrument for the creation and maintenance for a just and sustainable society? The answer is clearly yes. But it will not do so automatically. We can fall into increasingly isolated social behaviors, allowing others to fence us in, again, by reinforcing our existing biases and fears, or we can stretch out to connect and create community with other human beings far beyond our national boundaries, class expectations, and comfortable assumptions. We can turn everything into an anonymous swap for dollars, or we can build and expand a social contract of mutual commitment. The internet has, I think much to our surprise, provided us with a new way to achieve some of humanity's deepest aspirations. Function is actually morphing into structure. Fences are yielding to freedom. A new economy of mutuality, respect, affinity, and openness, which serves humanity and protects the planet, is now possible. Not only to imagine, but to implement. The question, as E.F. Schumacher would have been the first to ask, is whether, given the opportunity to realize our dreams, we now have the vision, the discipline, and the will to seize it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. From a process point of view, I think what we will do is have 2 to 3 questions just for Bob, and then we'll open up the floor to questions around the convergence and divergence of Larry and Bob's thinking. So I will just pick, and if you cannot come to the mic unless I've sort of pointed you so we could get a representative sample of people. So in the front here, and then you. And
In Professor Lessig's provocative talk, he mentioned the importance of speaking so that others will listen. And I kept thinking, yes, but does the internet give us an opportunity to listen so that others will speak? And then Bob talked about the Global Reporting Initiative. And I thought, from what I know about it, that that's a good example of how you used the ability of the internet to listen so that others would speak. And Bob, I wondered if you would like to elaborate on that.
Can we just... Thank you very. Oh yeah. Thank you very much. I think one of the things we are all experiencing in very rapid time, so we don't fully understand it, is the way in which we are actually achieving, sometimes in a very frustrating manner and sometimes in a very positive manner, a more and more common language. I mean, simply speaking, my son just spent 2 years in China, and everyone in China, in order to participate globally, is seeking to learn English. We can review that historically, but that's a reality now. And I see that partly as a desire to participate in a global conversation, both speaking and hearing. In terms of the Global Reporting Initiative, the piece that I find fascinating is that I see more and more this idea that you do not gain power simply by imposing things from the top, but by drawing people into a larger and larger connection of mutual agreement, which I think is something that Larry also referred to as part of movement building. And so that the notion that people gradually buy in to a common vernacular or a common language or a set of standards is a way that we're seeing more and more people move forward. I'm not sure that answers your question exactly, but that's certainly what we discovered with the Global Reporting Initiative, and I think we now see more and more people pointing to this notion of people self-aggregating rather than being dictated to in order to create a vocabulary of action.
Next question.
I think many of us are concerned about the manipulation of internet communication by government or corporations which own platforms. I understand it takes a huge amount of power, electric power, to run parts of the internet. And in China, the internet was shut down, or parts of it were shut down for periods of time. This is pretty scary. And I wonder if you can comment on how we can be sure that we can continue to communicate as broadly as we do now. This is all apart from the question of surveillance, but just simply the reliability of being able to universally communicate.
I think that every powerful technology in the history of the world has been, people have attempted to use it to control other people. And you're, I think, undoubtedly right to be concerned that this new, powerful, pervasive technology people are going to attempt to abuse it. And I feel very strange standing next to the world expert on the open internet, commenting, except to say that this is a battle that we must fight. And it's directly linked to the issue of democracy. If we allow increasing centralized gatekeepers, corporate control, to exert interests in their own commercial or political interests to confine us into certain characteristics, then the fear that you have, I think, will definitely be realized. On the other hand, if we battle that, and here, Larry, I really do want you to comment on this because it's directly connected to whether we can fight back in a sort of culture of resistance and independence as citizens to make sure that all of our interests are served, not those who happen to control the server farms or the code or the copyright or the patents.
Well, I certainly agree with the importance of preserving, but I think we sometimes don't even recognize how radically it has changed. 10 years ago, so 1997, 1998. I'm sorry, 2002. 15 years ago is what I wanted to talk about, but 2002. The internet was the internet, and the internet today is a kind of linking of a bunch of different platforms, And these platforms are increasingly proprietary platforms. So the reason I wanted to talk about 97 and 98, in 97 and 98, Microsoft was challenged by the government because the allegation was that Microsoft tried to stop Netscape from developing a browser in a way that might eventually compete with Microsoft. They said they didn't do it. The government said they did do it. There's a huge fight about it. Today, the power which Microsoft allegedly exercised is routinely exercised by the dominant platforms on the internet. So Apple chooses which applications are going to be on their platform. They didn't want the Google Map on their platform anymore. I update my Apple phone, it's erased, it's gone. I cut the air supply for the Google Map on my iPhone. Twitter asserts its right to choose which developers are allowed to develop on their platform. Facebook expresses the right to control what kind of people get to develop and what they get to do on their platform. It's increasingly become these proprietary platforms that are linked together by the internet. And that change has happened without anybody kind of standing back and saying, is this something we ought to be encouraging or resisting, or what is its relationship to this ultimate question of sustaining the environment of free and open exchange? Now, I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but I do think it's clear that we don't yet have a rich enough understanding of that dynamic and where it heads. You talked about walled gardens. These are islands where before we had an internet.
Let's open up the floor to questions for both Bob and Professor Lessig. Yeah, if you go first.
Hello. I was rather excited that both of you mentioned 350. I just went to see Bill and Naomi talk in New York City and was rather inspired to get university campuses to divest from fossil fuels. You may or may not be aware that the Harvard Undergraduate Committee or Council.
A little more slowly, or
Oh, sorry. The Harvard Undergraduate Committee or Council, I just saw the acronym, voted 72% to encourage the Harvard administration to divest from fossil fuels. So I would like to, first of all, friendly encourage you to help them out. However, I don't go to Harvard, I go to MIT. Has a bit of a different mindset. I was wondering what advice you might have.
well, for those of you who may have read Bill McKibben's incredible Rolling Stone article in August, I'm quoted in that article as emphatically in favor of divestment. And this comes, Eleanor mentioned this briefly because I wrote an unbelievably, ridiculously long book on the South African divestment question, why it worked, why it didn't work, what pieces can be, what lessons we can learn. I do think that the climate crisis is overwhelmingly urgent, that I've been working on it for more than 25 years. It remains a disgrace that the United States has not addressed this much earlier and much more emphatically. I've spent a good deal of my career trying to change that. I'm hoping that, Al Gore used to say the United States only has two speeds. It's, stop and lightning. And we have been at stop resolutely. I am hoping that now we are seeing, because of 350.org, because of, sadly, Hurricane Sandy finally waking people up to the physical consequences, and because of the recent election, that we're going to start moving towards lightning. It's long, long overdue. And I'm sure that there's more that we could all be doing. But I'm pleased to say some universities have already made this choice. And one of the lessons from the South African divestment movement is it doesn't have to cost you a huge amount of money. They mostly don't want to get involved in it because they don't want to politicize the ownership of stock. But when you think about this, which is more important, the benefiting from companies whose business model is to wreck the planet, or taking a stand for having a planet on which the future educated graduates can live. along with everyone else. So I feel pretty strongly about this. Larry, do you want to?
I think it's really important to recognize we can't do either of these things on their own. Let's just remark, 2008, I gotta get my years right, I'm sorry. So 2008, both presidential candidates said climate change was a pressing issue. 2012, neither presidential candidate mentioned climate change during the whole of the campaign. Not a single question addressed in the context of debates about this. So that's not an accident. The reason for that is that in the 4 years between, the Lesters has succeeded in blackmailing both parties into recognizing this cannot be an issue, and it won't be an issue. So, of course, if of all the other issues out there, substantive issues, think of climate change right at the very top. But unless, climate change activists can recognize the number 2 issue to be this corruption issue, and the healthcare activists recognize their number 2 issue has to be the corruption issue, and the financial reform people have to recognize their number 2 issue is the corruption. Until that can happen, none of us are going to make progress on any of the substantive issues that we care about here.
Thank you.
So to keep us on time, we're going to take 2 more questions. So one there and one last question and one there. Let's see.
So because it's an Al Gore night, I thought I would preface my question based on an AMA that Al Gore gave on Reddit last week. And he says, and we need to protect the freedom of the internet against corporate control by legacy businesses that see it as a threat, and against the obscene invasions of privacy and threats to security from government and corporations alike. Please think about this. Almost every time there has been a choice between privacy and security on the one hand, and convenience on the other, the massive folks have chosen convenience. I, for one, believe that the stalker economy on the internet is undemocratic and anti-American. Are folks at the gag point on this yet? And what I love about his answer on this question is that he genuinely asked a question as his answer. He really wants to know what Redditors and the internet think. And so my question to either of you or both of you is what questions do you have for the internet? I mean, I'll definitely relay them right now. I have been the whole night. And I've been doing it through Identica and other networks that are not Twitter or Facebook that are distributed. So, thank you.
Well, early in the internet revolution, there was a wonderful phrase, the cornucopia of the commons, and one of what this was referring to was most of the major movements happened as a byproduct of people doing what they wanted to do. So, Napster takes off. Why? Not because a bunch of people convinced people to work to the cause of making a global music archive available to everybody, but because when you downloaded Napster and you ran it on your machine, it by default put your music collection in a folder that was accessible to the rest of the world. Most people didn't care about the fact that they were contributing to the global commons of music. They just wanted their own music, but as a byproduct, they produced this stuff, right? So, and I think that you can see that in so much of the enormous value inside of the internet. Google's whole architecture trades on taking advantage of the information they gather as people get what they want on the internet. So you search, you pick the 3rd item on the Google search. Google has now learned something about which item should have been the 1st item, right? And so we give Google that information, not because anybody has said, work to the common good of Google. It's because you're just giving Google something because Google's giving something back to you. We've not yet seen, I think, I want to make sure I'm right about this. I hope I'm wrong about this. I don't think we've yet seen the internet's sacrifice. Like people building something huge because they're working to build something huge, not because it's giving them something back in return. I don't know that we've seen that yet. And so maybe we shouldn't be aiming for that. Maybe we should just try and be figuring out how we can produce social good by giving people what they privately want. There's a lot of opportunity for innovation there, and I'm not saying it's bad to do that. But I just wonder whether the internet can give us something without us giving us something back. Because I fear, and I think about the micro transactions that when I'm talking about needs, we've got to get it so people can talk to people they disagree with in a respectful and charitable way. That's hard. That's hard. It's hard to share that. It's hard to engage that and encourage that. That requires a dedication. It's a sacrifice. Well, I don't know the examples of that sacrifice that we can point to say, see, this is an example of the sort of thing we've got to do here. This is what I'm talking about. It feels like something new in this space, and essential but new, and I'd love to see if the internet could build it.
In mentioning the brevity of our lives, one of the things that I hope it does for people, it occasionally does for me, is remind me of the value of my own attention. And I think that if I were to ask the internet, or it's kind of an abstract thing, but if I were to encourage people who are using the internet, it is to think through some of these points that I touch on at the end, which is that we as conscious beings limited to a certain time on Earth have tremendous value, both to ourselves and to the world. And we throw a lot of that value away. I don't know whether it's low self-esteem. I don't know whether it's distraction. We've been trained as consumers. I know I do it myself. I look at Huffington Post. In the middle are all these interesting articles on substantive issues, and the other are all of the costume failures and 10 most cutest kittens in the world. And I get distracted, and I'm curious about costume failures and cute kittens. But then I sort of wake myself up. But we've all had that moment of drifting away. And so that's why cultivating a certain discipline of focus, and it doesn't sound fun, but if we could think of a manner in which we really restore our dignity as the dignity of our awareness, and stop trading it at such a low price to anything that comes in front of us, which somebody's using to try and dazzle us or attract us or sell us something, I think that that would be very valuable. I can tell you an interesting byproduct in our own family is that we have mostly stopped watching TV. We do watch stuff on the internet, but that's partly because we simply don't want to sit through the commercials on TV anymore, so we can get more apportioned stuff. And I suppose that's our mini revolution of cultivating discipline of attention. But I wish that we talked about that more. I wish we talked about that in schools more, that you can be lured away to do ridiculous things with your time and attention and intelligence, which we should have the self-respect not to do.
Thank you. So last question, our friend in the third row. Please keep the question brief. I have to play bad cop, and it's hard as a Canadian to do that.
So Mr. Massie, in your talk, you mentioned certain values such as empathy, collaboration, moderation, and sharing. And I see how it would be very easy to talk about these values among people who share them. And it's very difficult to talk about, say, virtues, especially to people who don't agree that we should even be talking about something like virtues. And so my question is about forms of persuasion, and this relates to Professor Lessig's talk. How do we convince others who don't share our values to consider them with a spirit of invitation, not with some spirit of like moral lecturing? And also just relating to your last comment, how do you think we would be able to do this in a society where we don't really have an objective standard for measuring morals or virtues. Is this possible in schools, or is there some sort of way we can do this in a structured way?
Well, one advantage of reaching a certain point in life, I have come to the conclusion that all cultures smile at the same things, that in fact there are many, many more nearly universal values, loyalty, honor, respect, things like that. They seem to cross cultures. Now, they're interpreted in different ways, but I think that I was much more interested when I was much younger about this question about how radically different we are, and the older I get, the more I feel that really humanity overlaps in our longing and respect for the same things. So it's less of a problem. There is, yes, of course, always the need to respect and interpret things in a way that people can hear, as we were talking before, culturally appropriate manner. But one of the things we learn watching international movies is that people cry over the same things. They're moved by the same things. Now, of course, there's a certain number of sociopaths in our midst, people who fundamentally reject what I would think are the sort of the predominant core human values. Some of those people pose real social problems for the rest of us. Some of them need to simply be released into their own community. But I don't see this as a more pressing thing. I think, in fact, what we've seen over and over again in international efforts is that people are drawn to the same kinds of aspirations, even when they speak very different languages, come from very different pasts.
So I want to think very practically about what the mechanism is, and adopt what I think is the internet model, which is we're always talking about what we're getting as a byproduct. So I don't know how many people have used FreeCycle. I'd just love to know how many people have used or know. Okay, so everybody, a lot of people, great. One of the byproducts of using FreeCycle, you sign up, and FreeCycle is a way in which you can say, here, I've got this, and I want to just put it out, and somebody can come get it. Or you can say, I need this, and somebody will say, I have it. But the rule is you're not selling it. No money is exchanged. There's no coordination. It's just, here it is, come get it. I signed up originally because we had something we wanted to give away. But, it's a hassle to get off a list, so we constantly get the FreeCycle. And one of the byproducts of getting these constant FreeCycle notifications is you begin to recognize how enormously generous people are. Someone will say, my daughter needs so-and-so for school, and then within an hour, this need has been satisfied. You see this. Or people say, I've got this television set, I don't need it anymore. Does somebody want it? And so begin to have this experience of looking at your neighbors different. I feel like I understand neighbors different. Like, these are really nice people out there. They're constantly doing nice things for each other. And as a byproduct of this thing, I begin to have a different attitude towards them. So what I'm looking for in the context of the struggle that I'm thinking about is, what is the context where we can get people of radically different views, Tea Party people and Occupy people, to be in the same place, where they're not trying to lecture each other, they're not trying to prove the other side is dumb or racist or whatever. But in that experience of being in the same place, they can have this moment of kind of recognition that they're not aliens on the other side, that, in fact, we do agree about the corruption of the system. And so what I'm convinced about that the internet constrains us to is that we can't do that by proselytizing. Yes, like you go to church on Sunday, you need to go to the internet corner and speak decently with each other. You can say that and 20 people will do it, but it won't have the dynamic that I'm talking about. So really thinking about the infrastructure that brings people into the common place so they have the recognition that, is similar to the recognition I have when I now think of my neighbors as much more generous than I did before, because I see them doing this just as a byproduct of me getting what I originally wanted, which was to get rid of a couch that we didn't want anymore.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot of convergence between two very different types of lectures. The root causes of inequality and corruption, the role of technology in creating exopolitical or citizen movements, the discipline, whether that was from a messaging point of view or from a personal vigilance point of view, the urgency, and most importantly, our responsibility as citizens to take an active role in these changes we want to see in the world. I'm just going to end on a quote from Schumacher himself that sort of nicely sums up both the sort of outrage we should have of what's happening, whether it's corruption in politics or blockages to the new economy, as well as the hope. I thus come to the cheerful conclusion that life, including economic life, is still worth living because it is sufficiently unpredictable to be interesting. I don't think Larry or Bob would disagree with that. And I'll start with sort of thanking Bob and Larry, if we could give them a round of applause, please.